What if the epicness that we sometimes spend our entire lifetime searching for exists not in spite of the boulders, but thanks to the boulder version of you, that these boulders inspire you to become? Often, when we least expect it, life thrusts us into the role of the reluctant hero or hero in our own story. How we respond in those moments can be the difference between thriving or just surviving. We believe that our story will be determined by how we dare to answer one burning question: how to choose to live. Join us as we explore the mindset shifts, innovative strategies, and captivating stories from my own life experience and those of my truly epic guests. So let's get this started. Welcome to today's episode of the How to Choose to Live podcast. And I am so excited to introduce you to my guest today because this woman shares so many of the values that are not only near and dear to me, but I know will be near and dear to you, because she is all about helping you develop, expand, discover, nurture your potential, whatever that looks like for you. And for you, when we say that, we mean for you as an entire person. So, Dr. Mary Key, welcome to the How to Choose to Live podcast.
Thank you so much, Meredith. I'm very excited to be here with you today. And you certainly have a commitment to helping people live purposeful lives. So I really admire that.
Well, thank you, Mary, so much. And I think that the older we get, the wiser we get, the more boulders we faced in our life, the more critical I think we come to appreciate that it's not kind of in spite of these quote unquote struggles and challenges and boulders that we succeed. It's really thanks to them that we discover some of the most rewarding aspects of our lives. So, why don't we start, Mary, by having you share? Were there any significant kind of boulders or aha moments in your life that kind of clarified things for you and got you on this remarkable path where you are today?
Great question, and so appropriate for my life. I did have a big boulder, and actually, I needed the boulder to wake up. I don't know if you've had that experience. I'm sure some of the
Yes.
people in your listening audience or viewing audience have had that experience as well, where all of a sudden you get hit between the eyes, you have a choice. You can go downhill and say, oh, woe's me, this is terrible. Or you can take a look at it and say, okay, what do I do next for the highest and best good for myself and for those I care about and around me? So I had one of those experiences for the first time in 2013. Ever since I was a kid, I had an extra sound in my heart. So the high school nurse used to always say, oh, Mary, you have a heart murmur. But what it actually turned out to be is a regurgitation. So every time my heart would beat, a stream of blood would go backward and it would have to go forward again. So the heart's a muscle, and in 2013, my muscle was getting too big for my chest cavity. So my doctor said, Mary, it's time. And I said, it's time for what? He said, you have to have your valve repaired. And so I had my valve repaired. At that time, I had a great entrepreneurial business. Um, uh, Inc. magazine had worked with me, and I helped them set up CEO roundtables around the country. Locally in the Tampa Bay area, I started CEO Florida forums, and attracted a lot of hard charging CEOs. Unfortunately, I didn't attract as many women, even though I tried. And so I had a lot of hard charging men who were great in that groups, but the focus was on making my business scalable. It was on merger acquisition. It was
Mhm.
on positioning things, getting the right people. And every now and then we'd get into issues around the whole self, the personal self.
Yes.
Usually when there was a crisis, some guy's wife was going to leave them, or, somebody had an illness. So anyway, I was working with these CEOs, and I also did some other work with executive coaching, and just a lot of work. And it was purposeful. However, I didn't really find my true niche until I had this heart surgery. So
Mhm.
what happened was, it was supposed to be, I mean, it's serious. It was open heart, but it was also supposed to be something that I could recover from in, a month and a half. And so after I had the surgery, I couldn't get well, and I couldn't get well. And I started to lose a tremendous amount of weight. And so my frame that normally carries about 137 pounds, I get down to 100 pounds. I look
Ooh.
like a scarecrow. And finally, because my blood cell count wasn't elevated so much, people didn't know what was wrong with me. They finally realized I had contracted a bacterial infection on the table, and I had endocarditis, which is extremely serious. So by March of 2014, I had to have emergency open heart surgery just to save my life. And
Wow.
so that was a very difficult time because I was in a weakened state. There's something called an ejection fraction in your heart. Some people might be aware of it. It's what helps your heart pump. It should be in the mid 50s plus, and mine was 26. And
Ooh.
my doctor said, Mary, I hate to tell you this. I know you love your career, but I'm not sure you're going to have the energy, the stamina to keep going
Mhm.
forward. You think about what you really want to do, because you may not be able to do it full time anymore. I
Wow.
was just crestfallen, Meredith. I couldn't believe it. I was like, oh my God, why is this happening to me? In the peak of my career, what's going
Yeah.
on?
So, just a hint, if you're listening to this, where uh, Mary and I are both in Tampa and we're having a little bit of internet issue. As a result of the hurricanes, we are
Crashing in.
recording this. Sorry. So let me fill you in. It froze for a moment. Mary
Okay.
hopped in to explain to the listeners that in the true spirit of resilience and forging forward, that you and I are both in the Tampa Bay area and we both
Okay.
have
Okay.
internet that is recovering. Um,
Yes.
so Tampa got its version of the big boulder not too long ago. Um,
Right.
that we're recording this on Halloween. So where,
Yeah, it's spooky.
yes,
Is
yes,
my is my well, I'll just make my story a little bit shorter, but I think it's very relevant to everything you're talking about. So
totally.
here I am, being told that I'm basically going to have less energy, need to figure out what I wanted to do less, and to sort of give up a lot of the things I really liked.
Yeah.
So I thought about it, and I thought, okay, I've always loved working with women in leadership. Done a lot of things in that area. I liked working with people in leadership roles, but it didn't necessarily have to be the CEO. And then I wanted to focus on mind, body, spirit, and career, as you mentioned earlier in the introduction. And so in 2014, once I started feeling better, I piloted a program I call the Key Women's Leadership Forum. Love my
Mhm.
last name because it kind of
Yes,
it's a good
yes.
name for that. And so it really took off. It grew. I got better. My ejection fraction's normal. So that restriction of maybe I'm not going to get well. But if it wasn't for that crisis, I wouldn't have started the Women's Forum. And it was so purposeful for me and helped so many women. The forum was designed for women in leadership roles, to be a support. There are a lot of women on, executive teams. They feel like it's lonely at the top, just like those
Yes.
CEOs felt. And because we focused on the whole person, it really created a very special place. So that was a wonderful gift in crisis, my big boulder.
So isn't that amazing? I mean, Mary, what you're sharing, and thank you for sharing that with us, is truly so remarkable because, to your point, we all face boulders. Some of them are feel a little bit more like literal boulders than others, and if you've been following along the podcast, you know that one of the pivotal
stories that this podcast is based on is my own daughter literally being crushed by a boulder that
Yes.
literally hit her between the eyes. And it's interesting, you use the word highest and best, which is something I think that when we get stuck in the cloud of confusion and which way should I go and overwhelm and all that, that question of what feels like the highest and best right now can add a huge clarity. And what is interesting to keep in mind that I think I definitely hear in your story is that it can be shocking to discover that often these boulders, whatever they are in our life, often aren't coming to destroy us, although that may seem like what it is initially. They end up coming and obliterating the things that we have been using to keep us playing small. And even though we spend, most of us, spend a tremendous amount of energy calculating how can we dodge as many boulders in our lives. And trust me, I'm not advocating that we go chasing catastrophe in our life, but what is interesting is we do live in a duality.
Mhm.
And so, just as those moments that are wonderfully victorious lift us up, those other moments really can have their own like gem-like value like you experienced in your own life. It's not in spite of those moments, truly is thanks to those moments that were we not to have felt exactly what we felt, whether it's fear, whether it's scarcity of time, whether it's questioning ourselves, have I done everything that I want to do? Have I lived a life that has made me feel like I've come truly alive? And I just love the way that you responded to this, Mary. And another sort of theme I hear here is that the real fulfillment that you found came in that sweet spot
Mhm.
between discovering what you were passionate about and your desire to serve others in
Yes.
a really profound way. Is that what
Yes,
I'm hearing?
absolutely. And I had that desire to serve, and it got expressed in different ways, but in a more traditional business context.
Yes.
And this allowed me to come alive, my body, spirit, and career, and to provide that support to others. As I personally grew
Yes.
myself, I would like to say something about this, Meredith,
Yes.
because a lot of times people think, oh, well, she just talked about how she had this awful situation and she could just snap right out of it.
Right.
Well, that doesn't happen. I mean, you feel sorry for yourself. You go through kind of the grieving stages of various kinds. The research out there now tells you it's not Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's like
Right.
exact,
Right.
but you might go through denial, you might go through blaming, just a host of different things. But to get to the other side, to me, it's all about sitting with your feelings, not judging them, not ruminating about them, and letting them dissipate to create a space for yourself. There are several thinkers that I have helped shape me. Um, uh, Dr. Wayne Dyer is one, Dr.
Yes.
David Hawkins, who's written a lot on power
Yes.
versus force and let go and let God. And then there's also more currently Michael Singer that wrote The Untethered Soul. And all of those books
Yes.
talk about this same principle of being with the feelings of whatever it is. It could be despair and grief, staying with it, but not like ruminating what happened. Just feel the feelings. And they do begin to dissipate and
Yeah.
then redirect. Okay, I'm going to take a half hour now just to think about the what's possible. And then I can go
Yeah.
back to and I just want to say that because sometimes I think that when you're on the other side of it, to other people hearing, it feels like it was easy for us and it's not for them. And I just want to recognize I know how hard it is for those of you who maybe had experiences or, like this, where you were struggling.
Absolutely. And thank you for really shining a spotlight, as I like to say, on that. And also, I think built into what you're saying is that just because your path is unique doesn't mean that you are alone, doesn't mean that no one else has their own reflection of this same sort of experience. And I
Right.
think that it's that harmony, finding the sweet spot between sitting with yourself, but not isolating yourself, being
Sure.
willing to ask, to say, and sometimes you don't even know what to ask for, right? I mean, and even being transparent about that and saying, I don't know what I need right now. May I just have a hug? Even if it's
Yes.
something like that, right? I
Sure.
just need someone to be here. I don't need someone to solve my problems. I don't need someone to tell me what to do. I just need someone to see me, to hear me, and to tell me that I'm valuable and I love you, but please don't tell me yet that everything happens for a reason, right?
Right. Yeah.
Because
It's
I
it's a
don't know what that is yet.
it's really um, allowing being a witness to people's feelings and emotions as opposed to trying to direct them or give them advice.
I absolutely agree that in our culture, we're very keyed up to be problem solvers. And I think sometimes there's an interim step that we miss. And that's the step of first, maybe just being there to help the person that you're trying to help see the version of themselves that they're capable of being, be the beacon beyond and say, I don't know, or, but I can imagine what it is that you might be feeling now. I've definitely had some boulders in my life myself. What I do know is who I know you to be. And if there is anyone that I can imagine, that I can see emerging on the other side of this boulder as that bigger, more epic version of themselves, it definitely is you. And so being very sensitive to what it is or what it means to be the champion of that person who is in their moment of grief, in their moment of devastation, I think is so critical and such a poignant observation along that path since to your point, every single path is unique and is different. And sometimes from the outside, it can seem like we've healed, and yet there still may be those moments. And we will be better with those moments when ultimately we agree that there are moments for solitude, but solitude does not mean that the only way through this is I must go this alone. So, Mary, let me dive into one thing that I feel like has been kind of a between the lines theme in what you've been sharing. And that is that I think that when I hear a lot of people come to me who are expressing frustration with their careers or how things are going professionally, often one of the underlying themes is it's almost as if my career is getting in the way of me living the life I've always dreamed of living, rather than having it contributing to the life that I envision myself living, the impact, the influence. So speak to that a little bit because I know that that is something that you help people really realize that harmony potential between the two.
Part of it is self-awareness, and the self-awareness is, am I doing this, what I'm doing right now, because I see it as something I have to do so I can eventually do what I really love. So if I earn money now and I do this, which is okay, that I can really become the executive coach or the torch singer or the you know, entrepreneur that I want to be. And I think the more that image of who we want to be and where we are goes further apart, the more difficult it is for people and the more that they struggle. So I do think it's important to ask yourself the question, what am I most passionate about? You know, if my highest wishes for myself were realized, what would I see? And Tony Robbins once asked a great question, and it's the if success were assured, what would I do? And I think sitting and reflecting on some of those things and not making what you're currently doing an obstacle, but really analyzing and say, okay, is this a path that's going to help me get to what my passion really is? And so I do think that being reflective on what that is and then bridging the gap between those things becomes really important. And if what you're truly doing is not really even close for you, then maybe it's time to rethink it. My experience is that when people take the risk, they make that leap. Many times they surprise themselves at things that they find that are much more in alignment with what's important to them.
That is such a great point, and it also kind of makes me think of when people come to me because they're contemplating a change in their career, some sort of self reinvention. Often, one of the themes that I hear is I want to help people. I want to feel like I have more influence, more impact. And where I am right now, I just feel like I don't really make a difference and like I'm not really heard. And the irony to me, when I hear something like that, is is really a couple of questions. One, when we're in a leadership position, are we getting creative with helping people feel heard, not only in the context of the team, but in that far reach of kind of social impact? And maybe it's mentoring other people on your same team or
Right.
organizing ways to have that voice. Because ultimately, here's the irony to me, ultimately, in its greatest form, it's in the context of team that we're able to make the greatest impact, not when we're kind of trying to do a solo flight. So the logical conclusion to that would be if we can find some place where we truly feel heard in the context of a team, we have the potential to go out there and make an impact much greater than we could do in a mere single human being's lifetime. So, what would you say to some of the leaders and maybe some of the what have you said to some of the CEOs who are stepping into our future relative toward this craving that seems to be expanding, not diminishing, for people to feel like I matter. And the only way that I'm going to feel passionate about what I do is if I discover that I matter in the context of my career.
Yeah, that's a tough one. And honestly, I'm going to step back for a moment and say, sometimes people feel that way because their own self-worth is defined by external things. So if I can influence these people, or if these people say I'm terrific, or if I've seen in the organization as really being one of the key people, that makes me feel good. And so how much of what you're describing is someone really wanting to help others, and how much is it really a cry for self-compassion and self-help? And you know, the most humble and skillful CEOs I've worked with, it's rarely I want the credit. I want to be recognized. I want to feel like I'm helping. It's just a natural way of serving others because they see that as the head person, they serve those who ultimately serve the customer. So part of what you're describing can also be a dynamic of someone's self-esteem and maybe feeling a little bit like an imposter sometimes, or feeling a little bit like, gee, if I had a more important job, I would feel more fulfilled. So part of that is a self-confidence, self-esteem issue. And I think it's important to look at that. Why am I really wanting this?
Yes, that is such an important perspective and introspection, I think, is and it is goes back to the question of what am I assuming that is not necessarily true, and what are one of the few things that I cannot control, and it is my circumstances and the world out there. What I can control is my own inner narrative and what I'm focusing on and what I'm making that mean. So,
Can I
so
just add to that what we're saying though,
please
before you
do.
ask me another question? So I
Yes,
think that this train of thought is very, very important. I think the
yes,
other side is, if you work in an organization and you aren't exactly where you want to be, how do you build your personal brand? So
yes,
one thing is to be known for something. I coached a person once who actually wound up being head of a company, but she started out as an administrative assistant. And I kind of met her later in her career. But when we were talking about how is it that you got from where you were now to where you wanted to be, she was known for always being the person you could count on. She always, when there were opportunities, especially if the opportunities weren't necessarily something other people would want to do, she would take them on. So as her career grew, for example, she was a manager in Tampa, and then she had an opportunity to move to Peoria, Illinois, which is not, you know, but she did it. And again, with virtual, it's a little different, but she did it because it built that whole reputation of, um, you know, uh, Shirley is going to fix things. If Shirley's in charge, she's going to fix things. And so she was one person who was built her brand on what people could count on her for. And then the other thing she did was very smart. As soon as she started to have people reporting to her, she was right from the beginning building them up so that they were ready, succession planning wise, to take her job. So I think how we view ourselves in the organization, how we express our talent. So what you're good at, that's you want to let that shine. If you're good at financial analysis, or if you're better at being creative and bringing that aspect in, so there are things you can do to build your brand in an organization and begin to really build that credibility. So I just didn't want to leave the conversation.
yes. No, that is such a really important thing to think about, because I think sometimes there's a bias to believe, well, companies and corporations have brands. I'm just an individual within the organization. Why do I need a brand, right? Other people define me. Well, not, yes, they will define you if you have not created a clear brand for yourself, and that you have quite a bit of influence over. And to your point, what do you want to be known for? What do you want to have a reputation for? And so
And that
along
should tie into something you're good at or a talent that you have.
absolutely.
Because we all have blind spots, or we have weaknesses. And
Yes,
in the industry I worked in all my career, which is human resource development, organizational development, millions, billions are spent on trying to help people um, correct a deficit. And
yes,
the truth is, you want to find people who are good at what you're not good at and
yes,
surround yourself with them and build on your strength.
yes, yes, yes. That's so important. And I think what kind of parallel to that is, first, that piece that you alluded to is getting the clarity of what are your strengths and developing those in collaboration with, of course, yes, we do want to strive for excellence in other areas that maybe we're not quite as strong as. And yet, once we get the clarity, going back to Tony Robbins, clarity is our power. So when we have the clarity, then to maybe hit the pause button a moment and say, okay, I have an idea of kind of where I am, but do
Right.
I still have clarity around who I am? And that is my passions aligned with my skills, my strengths, my gifts. Perhaps what I'm already known for, what are my experiences? And then now from where I stand and what I've learned, what are my must-haves? And then what are my, ooh, wouldn't it be nice ifs? And then as we can get clarity on that, I think a piece that people sometimes stumble upon, and again, going back to when people come to me, the assumption is almost always, well, the only way to get what I'm looking for is to look somewhere else, which is
Right.
scary to me because it's an unknown. And in some cases, they love where they currently are. They just don't love their role and they don't see a potential. And some of the biggest success stories that I have seen were from the people who, again, go through that exercise. And that's something that I do in a form of creating a little map with the clients I work with, but reminding them to ask if you've already decided I need to leave, I need to go somewhere else. And yet you see within your own organization a gap, perhaps, i.e., an opportunity.
Mhm.
Maybe people have even talked about, gosh, we just haven't had time to lay out what it would look like, who would be there.
Right.
Get proactive
Yeah.
and you create the vision based on if a kind of a spin on the question you asked earlier. If you could assume that the answer would be yes to your dream job, ideally within this maybe company where you really do like a lot of the people, what would that position look like?
Mhm.
And my gosh, give people the opportunity to say, huh, that's actually kind of brilliant.
Mhm.
And that could be the next chapter in your epic Shiro or hero story. Yeah. So how do you encourage people to assess when is the time to take that risk?
Well, I think one of the things that's really important that really helps in the executive coaching work I do, uh, an executive who can't always see what their strengths and blind spots are. And so the organization might invest and do a 360 assessment, which, I conduct and give feedback on. But I think people can do their own 360 if they're willing to do something that's very difficult, and that is to zip it. In other
Yeah.
words, to pick people in your environment, people who are peers, your boss, people that are in the organization that not necessarily that you always get along great with, and say, I'm really wanting to work on growing in my role here. And I wonder if we could spend a little time just my asking you 3 questions. The first question, what do you see as one of my strengths? And maybe you could give me an example. And then you just listen. You don't debate it. You don't bait it and say, well, don't you think this is a strength too? You just listen. And then you say, I know all of us have blind spots, and it's always hard to see your own. Are there some things I could do better? Or are there some things that, if I change, do you think I could be more effective in what I'm doing? And that's the hard
Mhm.
one to listen to. And I always suggest taking notes. And then, the last thing I recommend asking is, um, you know, is there something that you would like to share that I haven't thought to ask you?
Yes.
And then you take all that back.
Yes.
You thank the person, you take all that back, and then you gather it with the other people you've spoken with, and you look for patterns.
Yeah.
What are the strengths people see in me? Forget what I think are my strengths right now. Just right now, what do they see? Is there a pattern in what people think I need to improve on? Maybe I cut people off when I speak to them. Maybe I'm not always paying attention, and I'm looking at my phone, or I'm looking somewhere else when they're talking to me, so they don't think I hear them.
Yes.
What are those things? And then, are there some, or the last question could also be, is there something I can do to make your job easier? And that's always
Mm.
a great question. But I always talk about keeping it to 3 and taking that feedback, because what that does is it gives you a more realistic picture. Otherwise, sometimes people go off in la la land, like, oh, this is what I'm passionate about. This is what I want to be a hero in. That job looks really good, but they don't really know how they're perceived, and perception's reality in
Yes.
that work environment. So you got to be realistic about what you're working with too.
Yes, I think that's a great point. And one thing I want to make sure that as you're listening to this, that you really fully appreciate the weight of it. The question, what might I not know to ask that you think would be really valuable to know? That is a great question, not simply in the context that you just mentioned, Mary, but for those of you who are going into interviews, one of the final questions that you ask the people who are interviewing you, what might I not know to ask about this role or about this team or about this organization that you think that I should know that would be important in order for me to even exceed expectations were you to hire me, right?
Right.
There are always things, to your point, Mary, that we don't know, and that's a good thing. It gives us the opportunity to grow. So, touching upon, I think something that I don't know if it just flowed into becoming a passion of yours or just because you saw such a need, but there is a statistic, speaking of jobs and applying to jobs, that a male, now this is a huge generalization, but it is a recognized statistic that a male typically will look at a description of the ideal applicant.
Mhm.
And if 6 out of the 10 requirements or wish list elements he will say, yep, I'm going to apply for this. Whereas women can even have as many as 9 out of 10 of be able to check those boxes and they will still work hard to go, well, maybe they're not looking for someone who's quite as old as I am or who's quite as young as I am. And we women can have a tendency to talk ourselves out of something, of really even going for something before we even start.
Mhm.
So, what would you say to the women, regardless of their age? Are there qualities that women tend to naturally, and this is not always 100%, we know they're never 100%. This is a generalization, but in general, some of the qualities that perhaps are associated more with women that might be a different kind of flavor of leadership that can be particularly successful, because I think another thing that I often see is that sometimes women believe that in order to be successful, they have to emulate the men around them. And that can be a train wreck. So, what are your thoughts on that, Mary?
Well, Sheryl Sandberg, I believe, was the person that in her book Lean In first observed that she would have to reach out to the women in the organization because their response to her was, I don't have all the skills. And she's like, God, you have 90% of them. Whereas the guys would just apply. And that is something that has gotten researched, as you're pointing out. Part of it is that I think women are socialized differently. So when we're
Mm.
little girls, we're taught it's important to get A's It's important to be perfect. We get reinforced for it. Oh, good little girl. Oh, look, you got A's. I can remember my brother, my mother just being happy he got C's. But if I get a B in something, it's like, why did you get a B? So many times women are taught to be perfectionists, and if they're high achievers, that chances that they are even greater. And so the focus is on getting it right, as opposed to focusing on doing the right things, right?
Mhm.
And for a lot of men, when they're socialized, and again, I'm generalizing here too, they grow up playing sports. I'm the quarterback. Oh, I'm out of the game. Somebody else comes into the game. It's more fluid. It's less. I have to be perfect. More that I'm playing this team sport, and we're all got our positions. And why shouldn't I try this position? So there's a different socialization, and then when we become adults, women are viewed differently. Men are the perception of men who are decisive. Like, you think, what makes a good leader? Just male or
Yes.
female, what makes a good leader? Well, when you think of good leadership, it's they take risks. They're willing to go first. They take charge. They take command. They're assertive. All those characteristics line up for men, but for girls, they don't, because we're taught you're supposed to be nice, you're supposed to be collaborative, you're supposed to make sure everyone is involved. So naturally, the gender gap is also about the conflict that we have being brought up differently and what's reinforced. Sarah Blakely from Spanx, who actually, is from our not Tampa Bay, but from Florida.
Yeah.
But of course, obviously, the women around the world wear Spanx now.
Yes.
She talked about how her upbringing was different, in that her dad would sit down with her. You might know this story.
Oh, it's a fabulous one. Please share
Yeah.
it.
So every once a week, she and her brother would have dinner with their dad and mom, but the dad kind of led the discussion. What's a mistake you made this week, and
Right.
how did you address it? And so she was brought up being told it's okay not to be perfect. In fact, you should be making mistakes. What matters is how you address those mistakes. And
Yeah.
that's one of the reasons that a lot of women don't feel like they are done enough or deserving enough of whatever that next step is, because they haven't perfected it yet. And we have to get over
So agreed. And I think I so agree. And I even think it's kind of the A student syndrome a little bit, because especially if you've been good at academics and you've been able to figure out, it is a skill. You kind of figure out the patterns and you learn how to study. And it's very measurable to find out if you have succeeded. There's the A, there's the 100 or 98 or 99 on the report card. And then you get the diploma, the magna cum laude, and you're like, oh, I should be set.
Yeah.
The interesting thing is, to your point, what I have found, both in myself, because I confess that I'm a culprit, and it took me a long time to
Most high
do
achieving women
this.
are,
Yes,
and it's, once you're aware of it, then it's
yes,
a matter of how do I address it so that
yes.
I can change.
Yes, I had zero experience, quote unquote, failing. And what I defined as failing versus, the concept of failing is very subjective. We
Yes.
would love to think that it's very cut and dry, but it truly isn't. And it really, to me, and Cher, I would love to hear your thoughts as well. But to me, if there is one skill that is worth developing into an art, it is learning how to intentionally reprogram yourself to see opportunities in maybe the flabby thinking that you've gotten into a pattern of saying, oh gosh, that wasn't perfect, I failed.
Mhm.
Blah, that whole, and that even carries into what I think we've started to hear this concept called the tall poppy syndrome, where women are, if you're listening to this and you're not familiar with it, look it up online. It's a new terminology for the women who are the high achievers and they start succeeding. And it's not just men who are pushing them down, it's other women who feel intimidated and push them down. And so these tall puppies in the field start feeling really torn. If I want to be liked and accepted, which to your point, Mary, we definitely do. We want to be seen as kind and all the kind of dressings that come with it.
Right.
Um, then maybe we shouldn't outshine the other women and the other men. So it's a real push and pull. And oh, by the way, how do I be super mom at the same time?
Right.
Yeah. So I'm curious again, Mary, do you think with all these crazy, I'm going to use the word challenges, which I don't use a lot, but with these challenges that we women um, face and or have sometimes set up for ourselves, the flip side of that, would you say, going back to the question of, are there certain aspects of leadership that you think that we women can be naturally excelling at or predisposed to
Mhm.
when we learn how to kind of deprogram ourselves and get out of our own way, especially if we're a high achiever?
Yeah. Well, one big one is, when you look at emotional intelligence competencies, again, we're talking about averages, but women have a tendency to be more collaborative and more empathetic. And that can be very, very powerful in an organization, because the organizations that perform at the highest are the ones that have high performing teams. It's not about a leader that's the best. And so I think that that's a real strength women can build on. The other area I think that women are very good about is that the commitment to being diligent on something. I think many women uh, excel in that particular area. And so where can they bring in the more masculine, not necessarily always in the form of men, but so that you have this container, this is, if you look at yin and yang, you look at the yin being, this ability to collaborate, this ability to empathize, this ability to execute and get things done. So I think it's really important for a woman to develop a vision with her team, not about her, but about where the team sees itself going. It's
Yeah.
important for a woman to frame things in such a way that she is seen as a strategic thinker. And so a strategic thinker is someone who works with their team to say, okay, let's helicopter over this situation and decide what's the best course of action that we might take, and how can that maybe help us do something differently here, because we all agree that this has to change. So I think that there are some ways that women can build on strengths and then sort of let go of being the dutiful, like you can overdo dutiful and executing. I know many situations where people will say, oh, I'd love to promote Gladys to this position, but we can't. She has to be in this position because nobody else can do it, because Gladys she's just got it down. And if so poor Gladys is grooming all these other people, and
Yes.
many of
Yeah.
them are men, and they're getting ahead, and Gladys is doing the same thing, for 15 years. So yeah, I think that would be some of my recommendations to address what you said.
I love it. So equal opportunity here. So the men who might be listening to this, there's been more and more chatter about the pressures of the mask of masculinity
Sure.
and how that can get in the way of not only enjoying any sort of success that you might create for yourself,
Yeah.
but things like your mental health, your stress level, which ultimately then translates into your physical health and feeling. Of course, a lot of men are more and more exposed to Brene Brown and the concept of empowering vulnerability
Mhm.
and the virtue of that. Speak to when you were working with the group that had so many men in it. What do you think were some of the first things, the first places that they could really start to expand their capacity
Mhm.
as men so they still felt strong, looked strong, maybe authentically or becoming even stronger because of that quote unquote vulnerability and new wisdom? What sort of advice would you give to a man who strives to become a better leader and realizes that moving forward, the concept that drove a lot of the male leaders in the past, the it's not personal, it's just business, is wearing really thin with current generations and future generations? What would you say to them?
Men have it tough too. And we've been talking about
Yes.
the women's side, but think about it. A little girl could cry or
Yeah.
express her feelings, and little boys are told, "Hey, toughen up, come on, you know, stop crying, don't be
Right.
a baby." So the learning how to contain your feelings is something that young boys are still taught to do, not all across the board, but a lot are. So the ones that learn that it's okay to be vulnerable, maybe it's difficult too for them because it can be awkward. And if in the middle of a meeting they just something strikes them a certain way and they start crying or whatever, um, that can freak some people out. So
Yeah.
it's how do you allow yourself to be authentic? And I think that's what we all have to shoot for, men or women, and there are different routes to getting there. But authenticity is about being clear on what your values are and being your
Yeah.
real self about them, and then as a leader hooking up with what those agreed upon values are to what you're working on together. And I think storytelling for both men and women is a very powerful way of communicating and getting your point across, so that you're not just saying do it this way because this is the way I do it, but
Right.
there was a time when I felt a little bit the way you're feeling right now, that we should just shut up and do it. And let me tell you about a situation that I experienced where someone taught me that's not always the best course. And so I think the more that we share as human beings and acknowledge sometimes that that's the case. And some of this is cultural because the women before us that were really the Betty Friedan's and those folks, they many of them had to become very masculine in their own
Yes.
way, and they taught
Yes.
themselves, okay, I'm gonna dress with shoulder pads, and I'm gonna wear sort of fake bow ties, but they're taught,
Yes.
i'm I'm gonna I'm gonna talk sports, I'm gonna try to imitate. So now we have a time where we don't have to be those things.
Yes.
So what do we find that's honest? And that's, what's your authenticity, and how having conversations about how are we as a team going to be authentic with each other, and how are we as a team going to, or as an organization, going to be authentic with each other. I prefer those words over vulnerable.
Yes.
Love Brene Brown. I think the word vulnerability scares a lot of men even now. And what you're really talking about is being open and willing to talk about who you are and trust others. That's, I would suggest authenticity is more the, and I hate to say business, but the organizational word that I think people can hear.
I love that. And interestingly enough, Mary, your this last statement that you made is really what gave birth to me and my vision of saying that I think our target really is to what we're all striving for is to really unleash the most epic version of ourselves. Epic
Right.
meaning empowered, purpose driven, innovative, and collaborative, right? And so rather than feeling like I have to improve, I have to improve myself or I have to give something else, or I mean, what if it's more about expanding into that bigger, bolder, more epic version of ourselves and realizing that even though we may be born, you know, technically as a woman or a man, we all have the capacity to harmonize some of the natural elements. We all have aspects of ourselves that are a little more masculine, and we all
Mhm.
have aspects that are a little more feminine. So as we can learn, I think, to view ourselves as whole beings, I think everybody tends to benefit from that. And if we can continue to move in that direction of expanding rather than contracting,
Right.
I think that our results will become more and more optimal. So, Mary, first of all, I just so appreciate your wisdom and everything that you're sharing here. And I really, really just want to acknowledge the contribution that you have given to probably more people than you imagine because of the contribution of your wisdom to these leaders. Because, of course, it has not only a ripple effect, but in some cases, a tsunami effect. So I want to acknowledge you for
Thank you. And you as well, what you're doing, the work you're doing and bringing all of this to the forefront is so important, Meredith.
well, thank you so much. So, and thank you to those of you who are taking the time to listen to this, because this is how we become better versions of ourselves, as by being open to, you know what, there may be more to me. And how do I discover more to me? It's by listening to others. That's how I find the parts of me that may be hidden in the blind spot. So kudos to you if you're listening to this. And so now, it is time, Mary, to ask you three questions that I ask of all my guests. And no pressure, of course. So the first one is, if you were to imagine and envision that now we're 100+ years in the future. And so it's our grandchildren's grandchildren. Humanity has gone so far. And yet, for whatever reason, they have lost access to a lot of the great wisdom that would help them in their quest of how to choose to live so they could look back on their own lives feeling that they had been truly alive. So, if you had just a few moments with them to share three pieces, three gems to get them started to answering their own version of how to choose to live, what would those three pieces of wisdom be that you might choose to share?
Well, I think one we've discussed in different forms, and that is the importance of finding purpose in what you're doing. And that purpose ideally is not just about you. It engages and brings betterment to others in your life. So realizing that, I think the second would be, which ties into it. It's, some people call it the golden rule. There was a guy that his name is escaping me right now, that used to call it the platinum rule: do unto others what you think they would like you to do unto them, from the
Mm.
positive perspective, as opposed to do unto others as you'd want them to
Yes,
do unto you. So that you're actually thinking
yes,
about, Meredith might really like it if we put her on television because she's good at
yeah,
that. But if I put Nancy on television or Jack on television and they hate it, that's not
Yes.
going to be a nice treat. So really
Yes.
thinking about how can I, from that person's frame of reference, serve them in some form. And then the last area I think is don't forget your humanity. Your question on some level makes me very sad, because I do fear, with a lot of the things going on in the world, that a lot of the wisdom will get lost because people are watching fragments of things. And AI enables them, and I love AI, but enables
Yes.
them to make up things, so things are not always real. It's important to look at the wisdom of the ages, the wisdom of the past. Quite a few years ago now, he's deceased, but Dr. Wayne Dyer wrote a book called Wisdom of the Ages, and he actually went back and looked at Socrates and different people,
Yes.
and what you could glean and how you could apply that. So I think the last thing would be, I think the saying goes, it's important to go back to history, otherwise you're destined to relive it.
Repeat it.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
Yes.
so those are the things.
So beautiful.
So
So beautiful.
purposeful, really being not just authentic, but to serve others in a way that comes from their frame of reference. And then, of course, to really go back and study others, and don't assume that what you have in your current environment has captured all those things, especially if something were to occur on the planet that would limit information for some reason.
Yes. Yes. And I kind of, to your point, go back to a word that was created long before you and I, and that is the concept that we are humankind,
Yeah.
and with an emphasis on kind, right? We're not just human, we are humankind.
Right.
So,
Or also that in time with that, we are human beings. So we're not
yes,
human doings. Like, we're defined
exactly.
by what we do. We're being. And
Yes,
if you
yes,
be with your whole
yes,
self, you're
yes.
present. Yeah.
And I love that you mentioned that, because one of the inspirations of this podcast is one of my favorite Howard Thurman quotes, which is, don't ask what the world needs, ask what makes you come alive, and then you go do that, because what the world needs is more people who have come fully alive,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
in other words, who are willing to step out there and saying, who am I going to show up today being defined by me, right?
Right.
So bringing me to my next question, that would be that personally, I believe that we have one goal and one goal only. And I believe that that one goal is to be taking our last breath, able to look back at our life and say, oh my gosh, that was truly epic. I hope I have the chance to do this again sometime. Everything else along the way is an objective, an opportunity, the next finish line, a possibility. So, for you, Mary, if you were to look back on your life, everything that you've accomplished, that you've done, that you've been so far, what are one, two, or two things that stand out that even right now you could say, if this is all I got, this would feel like mission accomplished?
How I make others feel.
Mm,
Yeah. Because people don't remember necessarily what you do, but they always remember how you make them feel. And you can do that in your life. It's every day you can
yes,
smile at somebody. And if you experiment with that, it's really interesting, because
yes,
so many times somebody looks really gloomy and rough, and you give them a big smile, and it just changes their day. So it can be something small, and it can be something big. It can be talking to someone about a frustration they have in their life, and seeing them change the course of what they've done. For me, the second thing is, because I've had the privilege of working with so many people in leadership roles, it's what you were saying earlier, Meredith, that their impact, their span is so much greater. So if some of the things that we worked on together that have made a difference for them get spread to others, that's as good as it gets.
Ooh, beautiful. Beautiful. So the final question
Oh,
is
there's more.
the final question. Woohoo! Then we rip open the envelope. So the final question is, if you were to discover that at some point within the next 2 years, that big boulder
Oh,
is going to fall,
yeah.
what might you be willing to risk even further that you haven't maybe yet tried or done that would give you a shot at making that mission accomplished even bigger?
I think for me, it would be um, saying yes to more things in my daily life. Not that I say no a lot, but like somebody will say, hey, you want to go skydiving? So I think that if I had 2 years or so left before the big boulder, I would just commit myself to saying yes to everything that comes to me.
Yes. And it's fun as you were answering that, it made me feel like we're closing a loop with that back to your mention of Tony Robbins. And if you knew that you were going to succeed,
Right.
what else might you do? And in a way that goes back to, oh gosh, one of the heartthrob movie stars, um,
There's so many.
James Dean.
Who? Oh,
James
okay.
Dean of years gone past.
Yeah.
Um,
I
long,
think
like
both of us watched him
yes, for
before.
both of us.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Um, if you look in those oldies movies, you can see him. But I think he had a very famous quote is, "What would you do if you knew you could not fail?"
Yeah.
Right? And I think that concept to remember is one to wake up and remember every day, and to realize that the moment, kind of to your point, the moment that we are living right now, we have never lived. I don't care what has happened in the past. This particular moment is pristine. And so the choice is, are we going to make it something memorable? And even to your point, the opportunity to create a tsunami. And how are we going to make other people feel? How are we going to inspire people? Are we going to help people to see the world in maybe a way that right now they don't have the capacity of seeing? Or are we going to take this moment and kill it? Kill time, right?
Netflix it to death.
Exactly. Exactly. Or I think almost worse, decide that it's, the game is rigged, right? And what's the use? So I think that's part of this conversation of how to choose to live that I've just loved having with you, Mary.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure being with you as well. One of the things I'll do is I'll send you a link to a blog I wrote on that. How do you do your own 360? So if
Yes.
you want to share that as a resource with people, you can, because
I will put that in the show notes.
yeah.
Absolutely. That's amazing and exciting. And so speaking of which, share your website with, and again, I'll have all of this in the
Sure.
show notes, but just share with people who are listening, what are the best ways to connect with you?
For me, it's actually my website and also LinkedIn. My website is drmarykey.com, spelled drmarykey.com. And my email is mary@drmarykey.com. And then I am on LinkedIn as Mary Key in Tampa Bay and have quite a few followers. So would love to, connect with you. Reach out.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, Mary, thank you so much. And again,
Very welcome, Meredith. Thank you for the chance to know you better.
Yes, it's been wonderful, and additional kudos for your tenacity. As you're listening to this, we are filming this just a couple of weeks after not one but two hurricanes
I
came
know.
barreling through.
Hopefully that,
Oh,
we're those of you that are going to watch this, some of it, and Meredith will tell you, we lost power or internet a couple of times, and
yeah.
other things, the challenges you face when you're in a storm. So this is really interesting. I tried to wear the same outfit for this time.
I
So your
love it.
challenge is, am I wearing the same earrings I was
Yes,
I couldn't
yes,
remember.
yes, yes. The continuity police, right? In the
Some people are
movie
good
where,
at that. My husband's one of
she's
those
not wearing
people.
her necklace. Yes,
Right.
yes. I love it. I love it. So Tramily, wonderful. How to Choose to Live Tribe Family, Tramily.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening to this. And I know that you know at least one person who would just benefit so deliciously from hearing this conversation. So I'm going to ask you to not only do us a favor, but do them a favor by sharing this episode with them.
Oh, I'd be delighted to. Just send me the link. I'll do it.
Amazing, amazing, amazing. And if you're watching this, if you would also share and comment, we want to hear what your big ahas are and what your perspectives are on some of this. And of course, stick around for the bonus tip at the end of this, where I'll kind of pull some of this together. And we look forward to seeing you in the next episode of the How to Choose to Live podcast. Mary, thank you so much for
You're so
joining.
welcome. Bye-bye.
Are you ready? It is time now for our bonus tip. So let's think back on what we learned in our conversation with Dr. Mary Key. It was really about different ways to show up as that whole, I like to call it epic version of yourself that's empowered, purpose driven, innovative, and collaborative. And one of the exercises that, yeah, sounds a little scary sometimes, that Dr. Mary Kay suggested is doing your own variation of a personal 360. And before we hop into kind of making it so, I just want to give you something to ponder. Often, let's face it, we are really uncomfortable when we feel like we're being criticized or judged, or when people are giving us input. Now, I will be the first to say you are not obligated to take all input. You are not obligated to give every statement that someone passes your way to give it traction. However, what can be really, really valuable is when you shift into that inner game curiosity, where you ponder safely, almost, again, this is my metaphor of the virus protection. We're going to check and see, is this something that could be beneficial for the internal technology, for the code, for the system? And if it is, then having some sort of constructive input and saying, how might this benefit me? And then applying it, that actually is a great addition to the system. In other words, to you. So feedback doesn't have to be something that is implying that you are not perfect, or that you are not worthy, or that you are not appreciated or value, or that you don't have tremendous potential. In fact, the sooner that you can get comfortable with the concept that coaching is the secret sauce of going further faster, the more you will be able to stay unstuck and get out of your own way and benefit from everybody else's experience around you, which means that you might be able to avoid some boulders and just extract the wisdom from those boulders. So, with that little caveat, let's go into today's bonus tip. And that is her concept of doing your own self orchestrated 360. My challenge to you would be to figure out 3 questions based on the 3 questions within this podcast episode that you can ask some people that you trust, and maybe even be bold enough to ask some people that there's just a little bit of friction with, and to help you understand, not not taking every single criticism and harshness to heart, but to see, is there a nugget there? Is there something that I can learn? Maybe it's just that type of personality. Maybe it's that type of person who has that kind of experience. Is there something that you can learn so that going forward, maybe even with them, you can have a more collaborative relationship, even when you don't have the same set of experiences or agree or see anything close to eye? How can this benefit you and the influence and impact that you want to make as a whole? So today, the bonus tip is to get bold and go out there and see how you can execute your own personal 360. I'm Meredith Alexander, and I so look forward to seeing you in the next episode of the How to Choose to Live podcast. Booyah!